In 1936, a woman named Florence Brown walked into a federal courtroom in New York City. She was a drug addict, a former prostitute, a former madam, a woman whose life had been lived entirely inside a world that polite society pretended didn't exist. She sat down. She looked at the most powerful criminal in America sitting across from her at the defense table, and she repeated the words she had heard him say, words that would send him to prison for 30 years. He had told her he wanted to run his brothels like the A&P, like a chain store, like a supermarket, like a corporation with standardized products, centralized management, and locations in every neighborhood of the city. The most powerful man in the American underworld, the man who had invented the commission, who had murdered his way to the top of organized crime in New York, had looked at the prostitution industry and seen not a vice racket but a business model. 5,000 women, 200 brothels, $10 million a year, running like clockwork, managed like a corporation, generating money with the reliability of a utility company. This is how Lucky Luciano turned New York's brothels into a $100 million mafia cash machine. Picture this moment first. June 6, 1936, New York Supreme Court. The verdict comes in. 62 counts. Guilty on every single one. The judge looks at the most powerful criminal in America, the man who had survived a throat slitting, engineered 2 mob assassinations, invented the governing structure of the entire American underworld, and lived in a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria, and sentences him to 30 to 50 years in prison. The longest sentence ever handed down for compulsory prostitution in American history. Luciano sits in the courtroom and says nothing. He has just been convicted of running a vice racket by a prosecutor who admitted privately that what he actually wanted to charge him with was murder, narcotics, and the entire apparatus of organized crime. But he couldn't prove those things. He could prove the brothels, because Luciano made one mistake in an otherwise flawless criminal career. He treated prostitution like a business, and businesses leave records. But to understand how a man who had just invented the most sophisticated criminal governance structure in American history ended up in a courtroom over a vice racket, we have to understand what he built, and why he built it the way he did. By 1933, Prohibition was over. The constitutional amendment that had created the greatest single revenue opportunity in the history of American crime had been repealed. The bootlegging empires that had made Luciano, Costello, Lansky, and Siegel extraordinarily wealthy were suddenly operating in a legal market they couldn't compete in. They needed new revenue. Gambling was already established. Numbers running. Card games, horse racing, the policy rackets that generated hundreds of millions across the city's poor neighborhoods. But Luciano looked at the prostitution industry and saw something that nobody had thought to apply to it before: scale. New York's prostitution industry in the early 1930s was enormous. The city's estimated 400,000 brothel visits per week generated millions of dollars annually. But the industry was fragmented. Hundreds of independent madams running their own operations. Independent bookers, the middlemen who supplied women to houses, operating without coordination. Pimps managing individual women with no connection to any larger structure. It was, in Luciano's language, disorganized, and disorganized meant inefficient. Inefficient meant money was being lost. Money that could be captured, systematically, reliably, at scale, if someone took the trouble to organize it. Luciano took the trouble. The system Luciano built was called the combination. It was not, primarily, a prostitution operation. It was a management structure imposed on an existing industry. The distinction matters, because it explains both how it worked and why it was so difficult to prosecute. Here is the architecture. At the base level, the individual women, working in houses across Manhattan and Brooklyn, earning a percentage of their fees, paying the house a cut for room and board and whatever protection the madam could offer. Above them, the madams, women who ran the houses, who managed the logistics of the operation, who dealt with clients, maintained discretion, and handled the daily business of a brothel. Above the madams, the bookers, the critical middlemen, men who supplied women to houses, who moved workers between locations, who maintained the inventory, such as it was, of available workers, and matched them to houses with demand. And above all of it, the combination. Luciano's men, who collected from the bookers, who collected from the madams, who collected from the women. The combination provided something that independent madams could not provide for themselves: protection. Not from violence, though that was available when needed. From the police, from district attorneys, from the machinery of law enforcement that could shut down a brothel on a Tuesday and have it raided again by Thursday. The combination had relationships with the NYPD's vice squad. It employed bail bondsmen who were on call around the clock. It maintained a roster of lawyers who appeared in court whenever anyone connected to the network was arrested. The bail was posted. The charges were managed. The business continued. A madam operating independently paid for all of this herself and got unreliable results. A madam operating under the combination paid her weekly tribute and got a guarantee. It was, as Luciano described it to Cokie Flo Brown, exactly like the A&P, a chain store system, standardized, reliable, scalable. At its peak, the combination controlled approximately 200 brothels across Manhattan and Brooklyn. It employed an estimated 5,000 women. It generated over $10 million annually in tribute, fees, and related income. In 1930s dollars, that was extraordinary wealth, accumulated from an industry that the city's newspapers covered as a social problem and its police department managed as a minor nuisance. No business operates without enforcement. The combination's enforcement arm was not subtle. Madams who fell behind on their tribute payments received visits, not from lawyers, from men whose job was to communicate the consequences of non-compliance in terms that required no legal interpretation. Florence Brown, Cokie Flo, testified at trial about a madam who had failed to keep current with her payments. A man named Tommy Pinocchio, known as Tommy the Bull, had been sent to discuss the matter. The madam ended up in the hospital. This was not an isolated incident. It was the standard operating procedure of a collection operation that ran exactly like any other mafia enforcement mechanism: loan sharking, extortion, the combination. The mathematics were identical. Pay on time, or the cost of non-payment exceeded the cost of the tribute. The women themselves were not exempt from this logic. Women who tried to work independently, outside the combination's network, found themselves unable to operate. Their houses were raided by police, whose cooperation the combination maintained. Their clients were harassed. Their madams were pressured. The market was closed. The combination was the only game. An entry into that game was not optional. Bookers who tried to operate independently were beaten. Women who resisted were threatened. Madams who thought they could negotiate different terms discovered that the negotiation had already ended before they asked. First, you got to step on them, Luciano had said. Talking won't do no good. You got to put the screws on. He was describing a management philosophy. One of the central ironies of the Luciano prostitution trial was the disconnect between the world the prosecution described and the world the defendant inhabited. Luciano lived in a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria. He moved between his suite, his private box at the Saratoga Racecourse, and the finest restaurants in New York. He wore custom-made suits. He was courted by politicians, entertainers, and businessmen who either didn't know what he was or didn't care. His reported income for tax purposes, $22,500 a year. His actual lifestyle, that of one of the wealthiest men in the city. The gap between those two numbers was the prosecution's entire case in microcosm. When Thomas Dewey put Luciano on the stand and questioned him for hours about his income, his lifestyle, and his relationship to the combination, Luciano denied everything. He denied knowing the women who testified against him. He denied having ever discussed the brothel network. He denied any connection to the operation that 30 witnesses had placed him at the center of. Dewey cross-examined him for 4 hours. By the end, Luciano had been caught in lie after lie, contradictions so fundamental and so specific that the jury could not ignore them. He denied knowing women who testified they had been entertained at his Waldorf suite. No, he denied conversations that multiple witnesses had independently recalled. He denied a world that hundreds of people had lived inside and were now describing in precise detail from the witness stand. His own attorney later said the decision to put Luciano on the stand was the single greatest mistake of the trial. Luciano's pride, the pride of a man who had outmaneuvered everyone who had ever come after him, would not allow him to sit silently while a government lawyer called him a liar, so he took the stand to deny it. And Dewey proved he was lying. 62 counts. Guilty on every one. Here is the name that most accounts of the Luciano trial leave out: Eunice Carter. Thomas Dewey gets the credit. His name is on the prosecution. His photograph is in the newspapers. His political career, which would eventually take him to the governorship of New York and 2 presidential campaigns, was built on the conviction. But the insight that cracked the case open came from Carter. Eunice Carter was an African-American attorney, one of the first to hold a position in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Working in the magistrate's courts, she noticed a pattern that nobody else had paid attention to. Women arrested for prostitution across Manhattan were consistently represented by the same small group of bondsmen and attorneys. The legal representation was too consistent, too coordinated, too identical across what were supposed to be independent, unconnected operations. Something was organizing them. Carter brought the observation to Dewey. Dewey took it seriously. He assigned investigators to follow the thread. What they found was the combination. The entire network, the bookers, the madams, the tribute structure, the enforcement mechanism, revealed by the one detail that Luciano's otherwise meticulous operation had failed to obscure: the bail bondsman. Every criminal enterprise has a vulnerability, a place where the machine leaves a mark it didn't intend to leave. Luciano's was the legal infrastructure he had built to protect the women in his network from prosecution. The very system he had built to keep his people out of prison led directly to his own. Thomas Dewey understood one thing about the NYPD's Vice Squad. He couldn't trust them. The Vice Squad's relationship with the combination was the mechanism that kept the brothels operating. Officers who were supposed to shut down prostitution were instead the primary protection that the combination paid for. Tipping off the Vice Squad before a raid would have been the same as tipping off Luciano directly. So Dewey didn't use the Vice Squad. He assigned 160 uniformed officers, specifically selected from outside the Vice Squad, to conduct simultaneous raids on 80 brothels across Manhattan and Brooklyn. The officers were given their assignments minutes before the raids were to begin, not hours, not the day before, minutes. No time for any information to travel through the channels that Luciano maintained. At precisely 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, every targeted address was hit simultaneously. 80 doors, 160 officers, 87 women arrested in the first sweep. The network that had operated invisibly for years was suddenly simultaneously exposed across the entire city. The women who were arrested, many of them with their own legal problems, their own histories with the police, their own reasons not to trust the government, were offered something unusual: cooperation. Not immunity from all charges, but consideration. The kind of consideration that a prosecutor can offer when he is building a case against someone larger than the person currently sitting across from him. Dozens of women talked, then dozens more. The case that Eunice Carter had seen the outline of in the magistrate's courts was suddenly filling in with faces, names, conversations, and specific details that placed Luciano at the center of an operation he had spent years insulating himself from. Word reached Luciano before the indictment came down. People were talking. The women, the madams, the bookers. The network that was supposed to stay silent was giving Dewey exactly what he needed. Luciano made a decision that, in retrospect, made his situation significantly worse. He left New York. He and his girlfriend, a Broadway dancer named Gay Orlova, traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a resort town with deep mob connections, a place where organized crime figures had maintained a kind of informal sanctuary for years. A place where local law enforcement had its own reasons to look the other way. Dewey proclaimed him public enemy number one. It didn't help. New York detectives traveled to Hot Springs on April 1, 1936, April Fool's Day, and arrested Luciano. His lawyers fought the extradition. They managed to delay it for 18 days. On April 18, Arkansas state troopers raided the Hot Springs jailhouse and extracted him. He was put on a train to New York under heavy police guard. His bail was set at $350,000, the equivalent of approximately $6 million today, the highest bail in New York history. The message was clear: the government understood exactly who it had, and it was not going to let him leave again. Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility, the maximum security prison in Dannemora, New York, on June 18, 1936. He was 38 years old, sentenced to 30 to 50 years. By the time he was eligible for parole at the minimum end of his sentence, he would be 68. The machine he had built kept running without him. Frank Costello assumed control of the family. The commission continued to function. The revenue streams, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, the labor rackets, continued to generate money. But Luciano was not done. In 1942, the SS Normandy, a French ocean liner being converted into a troop transport ship, caught fire and sank at its berth on the Hudson River. The fire was attributed to a welding accident, but in the climate of wartime paranoia, the possibility of sabotage was taken seriously. The U.S. Navy had a more immediate problem. The New York waterfront, controlled by the Mafia, was a security nightmare. Longshoremen who might observe German saboteurs were more loyal to their Union bosses than to federal authorities. The Navy needed cooperation it couldn't compel. Someone suggested that the man who could compel it was sitting in a prison cell in Dannemora. Naval intelligence officers visited Luciano. A deal was proposed. His cooperation in securing the waterfront, his assistance in preparing for the Allied invasion of Sicily, providing contacts and intelligence about the island's geography and population. Luciano agreed. Whether his contribution was actually significant, whether the invasion of Sicily benefited materially from his cooperation, has been debated by historians for decades. The Navy itself was circumspect about what exactly it received and used. What is not disputed is what Luciano received in exchange. In 1946, Thomas Dewey, now the governor of New York, the man who had prosecuted Luciano 10 years earlier, commuted his sentence on one condition: he leave the United States and never return. Luciano accepted. On February 9, 1946, he boarded a ship in Brooklyn. He never set foot in America again. From Italy, Luciano continued to maintain his connections to the American Mafia. He coordinated with the Genovese family. He maintained relationships with Meyer Lansky. He was present at a 1946 meeting in Havana, where American mob bosses gathered to discuss the direction of the organization. That was broken up when U.S. authorities pressured Cuba to expel him. He lived in Naples. He was photographed occasionally by Italian authorities. He gave interviews in which he denied everything he had ever done. He died on January 26, 1962, at the Naples airport, of a heart attack. He had gone to the airport to meet an American film producer who wanted to make a documentary about his life. Even at the end, Luciano was trying to manage his own narrative. His body was returned to New York for burial. The commission, which he had created 30 years earlier, attended his funeral. The brothel empire that had convicted him was gone by then. Dewey's prosecution had chilled the mafia's direct involvement in prostitution for decades. The mob had moved on to more profitable and less legally vulnerable revenue streams. But here's what the prosecution of Lucky Luciano actually revealed. Not that the mafia ran brothels. The city already knew that. It revealed the mechanism. The way organized crime could take any existing industry, legal or illegal, and impose a management structure on it that extracted revenue with corporate efficiency. The combination was not unique to prostitution. It was a template. The same logic: identify the industry, control the choke points, impose the tribute structure, provide protection as the service, was applied to garbage collection, construction, the waterfront, the fish market, and every other industry that the five families systematically infiltrated over the following decades. Luciano didn't invent the prostitution racket. He invented the business model that the entire American Mafia ran on for the next 60 years. The brothels were just the first application. Lucky Luciano sat in a federal courtroom in 1936 and was convicted of 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years. Dewey, who had built his entire career on the conviction, admitted privately that what he had actually wanted to charge Luciano with was the entirety of organized crime in America. The murders, the narcotics, the commission, the governing structure that Luciano had built, and that continued to function perfectly well with its architect behind bars. He couldn't prove those things. He could prove the brothels. And so the most powerful criminal in American history went to prison for a vice racket, ran from a penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria, managed like a chain store, built by a man who looked at an entire industry and saw not a collection of individual operations, but a single machine waiting to be organized. The A&P of prostitution: 5,000 women, 200 brothels, $10 million a year. And the chain store manager lived in a hotel suite and told anyone who asked that he was in the real estate business. It worked for 5 years. Then a woman named Cokie Flo Brown walked into a courtroom and told the truth. And Lucky Luciano's luck ran out. Luciano built his empire by imposing corporate structure on industries. The government wasn't watching. But not all of the mafia's money came from vice. Some of it came from the suburbs, from the quiet streets of Long Island, where organized crime built a billion-dollar hub so deeply embedded in ordinary life that investigators spent decades just finding the edges of it.